not long ago sat across from someone in the church, and we were talking about growing. We're talking about how do we grow individually, how do we get stronger in the things that God's doing in our lives, and how do we see other people grow stronger in what God's doing in their lives and such. And one of the things that I was reiterating, and I've been thinking about ever since, and really want to talk about this morning, is that growth is always intentional. Sometimes we think because we grow, it doesn't matter how I feel or even what I do, no matter even some of the antics that sometimes we go through. Next year, I'm going to be a year older. Hopefully, I won't look it, but there you go. We all grow older. So time just means that we grow. It's just something that we do. Through time, as time progresses, we grow older. Now, sometimes because of that, we take that and we superimpose that on our relationship with God. And we just think, well, I've been a Christian for 20 years. Well, that doesn't mean that you've grown those last 20 years. It just, even in a church, we think, well, this year we're this, and next year we'll be that. But in everything we do, especially in our Christian relationship, we need to understand that growth is always intentional. I believe growth happens. I believe God wants us to grow. I believe that's part of what the real aspect of our relationship with God. But it's something that is very intentional, and it's true even with us here at Core Church. We will grow. We're going to grow, but the growth is always intentional. It's something that we do by our deliberate acts. And there's a few things I just want to touch on real quick here before I get into the message that God's really put on my heart, is that to help us understand how are we going to grow? How do we grow? How do we grow from the day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, stronger in the things of God? And there's a few things that causes a church, more specifically, even us as Core Church, to grow. And the first is commitment. Commitment, intentional commitment causes a church to grow. When people say, I'm here, Pastor, I'm involved, I'm going to be connected, I'm going to be that. We want everyone to be here. We're not at the door checking IDs or spiritual levels or anything like that. We want everyone to come in, and I actually have that. Sometimes I'll run into someone and they say, well, do you want this person here or that person? Hey, we want you in church. We want you to be a part of hearing God's word, of being here. But what really helps a church grow is commitment. When people say, I'm here, I want to be there. Also, what really causes a church to grow are actions of sacrifice. When they say, I'm just not here, but I want to be involved in this, and I'll be willing to serve here, or I want to be out here. And actions of outreach causes churches to grow. When you say, hey, why don't you come and join me? Why don't you be a part? Why don't you be here or be a part of this, what we're doing? And I think it'll be something to really encourage you. I think it'll be something that will help you. I think it'll be something that you really enjoy. So these acts of service and these acts of outreach causes a church to grow. Also giving, of course. If we're going to grow, we're going to move to here, and we have these responsibilities, and giving of our time, giving of our finances, giving of our resources. These are the things that cause and help a church to grow. And as well, and I think just as important, really important to understand, is just obedience to how God leads us. What are we doing? What is God saying today? It's not ever good enough to say, well, God said this last week or last month or last year or my last church or the last decade, and so that's all I've been doing. But what is God saying to you now? And how we are obedient on this level today, right here, right now, is so important to understand, because I believe that's a key part of how we grow. Now, looking at all this and understanding all this of how we grow and such, I'm excited to announce just a real step of growth that is very intentional for us, how we're going to grow. And that step is something that some of you may be aware of, and I just want to formally announce it and understand, because we're moving this service, our Sunday service, from West Chase to Sunday mornings at our new church building that's just down the road. It's really close. That's the nice part. Maybe for some of you, it's a mile or two further away. Maybe for some of you, a mile or two closer, but it's not very far. Just down the road on the corner of Racetrack and Line Ball. So if you just go right down Line Ball and then just immediately turn right on Racetrack, immediately right there is a industrial park, and at the very end, in the very front, where you can see it literally from that corner, is going to be our new building. We're so excited about that. Yeah. It's exciting. So I was sharing with someone and said, we're going to be moving and stuff. And they said, oh, that's sad. We won't be here. And you know what? This is a part of a miracle. In case you missed that story, when Lisa and I first tried to get this, and they said, we don't rent to churches. We don't want a church in here. That was what they said over and over again. But we believe, because we knew God spoke that to our heart, we knew that this is where God wanted us, and God opened the door. And I believe even after we go, if another church moves in here, that's great, because that door will be open. Why? Because we opened the door, and we made a difference. But now it's time. This is part of a great story. This is part of the miracle story that I'll get to tell for 20, 30, and in the next 80 years that I'll be alive by faith. That's not funny. No, it should be a matter of prayer. Anyway, so that's going to be part of the story. But you know what? It can't be the only story. There has to be another story. There has to be another miracle. There has to be, and guess what God's going to do? Now, you see, this building is owned, or the rent is being paid by Grace Family Church. And they're allowing us to stay in there until we, as God opens doors, as we're going to see what God's going to do, take up the lease, in sometime in this fall. And so the real that's a miracle for us. And we get to go in there and do that and be a part of that, and then just see where God leads. But I think that's a story. That's a story we get to tell. That's a story and you know what? It's not going to be our last story, is it? It's just another story. In another story. And what God is doing in your life is the same way. There's a story that God is doing. There's a miracle that God is working today. But it's just the beginning of what God's going to do. And we need to understand that. And that all comes from understanding, okay, to get there, it's deliberate steps. We had guys, I just have to say, especially Mike and Chris, who've already spent over 40 hours working over there, building the stage. You just wait to see it. Now, we're going to do a little bit of time. That's not going to be done, and that's not going to be done. But it's going to be enough next Sunday, because everyone's saying next Sunday, March 1st. Don't come here, because if you do, you're just going to have to drive a little bit further down, It's really, really close. It's easy to get to. It's very, very visible. I'm excited about that, but I just have to mention Mike and Chris, who've put in hours and hours and hours and hours already, as well as several other people that have done painting and just doing everything we can to make it something that's really, really nice. See, those are very intentional steps, and those are very deliberate steps. And in our lives, we have to do the same thing. We want to grow. I believe that that's the heart of everyone that's sitting here in some form or fashion. You say, I want to get stronger in God. I want to grow in God. I don't know necessarily what to do or how to do that or how am I going to grow in God, but it takes deliberate steps. And I've seen so many people, because I've been in church all my life. I mean, born on the pew, slept under the pew, made out in the back of the pews. I mean, a different time. But anyway, I've been in church. I know church. And I understand it. And I've seen so many people. And this is why Core Church is even called Core Church. And it's about equipping others, because I want us to take what's at the core of who we are and build on that and grow in who we are. But I've seen people be in the church 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they were just the same. They don't change. And that's because I believe they're not taking deliberate steps to saying, God, what do I got to do? How do I got to change? What are you going to do to me today? What's the miracle for tomorrow? I love the miracles that God's already done in our lives and the doors He's already opened. But what about today? What about tomorrow? What about what God's going to do in the future? What about our children? What about our great-grandchildren? What about the future that we're building for them? That's the miracle that we're doing. So I want you to turn with me in your Bibles to Philippians chapter 3. And we're going to talk about this chapter just a little bit. It's a great, great chapter. But I want you to focus, before we talk about, the beginning, I want to focus you in verse 15. Verse 15, it says this, all of us, that's you and me. So that when he says all of us, he's talking about everybody. All of us who are mature should take such a view of things. In other words, literally what he's saying is all of us that want to be mature, all of us that want to grow, all of us that want to be stronger in God need to take such views, need to be intentional about how we see things, need to be intentional about these things that I've just talked about, okay? So that's the ending. So I just jumped to the ending. So Paul said, if you want to grow, if you want to be mature, if you want to understand how I get stronger in the things of God and what God's doing in my life and how I can live a different life, how I can be a different person, how I can think a different way, then you need to understand these things. So now we get to go back and talk about what are those things? Hey, wait a minute. What are those things? So we're going to go back, and I want to look at that just a little bit. Verse 15, then, is the ending, but how do we get there? In verses 1 through 9, let me go do this really quick. Paul basically talks about how his first efforts were, I'm going to do it on my own. I'm going to be good enough. And people, I see this all the time. You're trying to be good enough. You're trying to be spiritual enough to say the right thing, to look spiritual, to look good, to act spiritual, to say all the spiritual words. And sometimes people get really good at that, don't we? They know how to talk spiritual, and they know how to look good. They know how to behave this way and that way. But if you're doing it in your own efforts, and you're doing it through religion, or you're doing it just through form and function and not having a real relationship with Jesus Christ, it will come to nothing. And that's basically what Paul came to understand. He said, everything that I did, all this really spiritual things that I thought was just meaningless because it didn't have the relationship. And it gets down to his heart cry. He goes through and says, I did all this, verses 1 through 9. I did all this, and it didn't work. And he gets down to verse 10, and basically in verse 10, this is what he says, I want to know Christ. I don't want to go through the emotions. I don't want to just go through the actions. I want to really know God in my life. I want to sense Him. I want to feel Him. I want to know that when I'm taking steps, I'm actually growing in the things of God. That's Paul's heart cry. I want to know God. And he talks about, in the next several verses, he talks about how that happens. And that's what I want to focus on, verses 12 through 10. He says, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of His resurrection. I don't want to just look good. I don't want to have a name that says Christian, or I don't want to have a name that says denomination, or have a name that says this church. I want to be different. I want to know power in my life. I want to have that power in my life. That was Paul's cry. And so that should be, I believe, what our cry is as well. How do we know this power, the power of His resurrection, of Jesus Christ in our life? And let me just share and break these verses down for just a little bit, because I believe it's something that's going to really help us to take intentional steps. How do I grow? How do I grow? Here's the first one. Intentional growth comes from being defined forward by God and not backwards by this world. You got to think about that a little bit, and they're going to leave that up so you can write all that down. It's a long one. Wow, that's a long point. Take a picture of it, and you'll have it. Intentional growth comes from being defined forward by God and not by how this world defines us. See, we're becoming what we allow to define us. You are becoming what you allow to define you. If the world defines you as this or over here, that is what you will become. What you allow the world to define you as is what you will become, is how you will behave, and actually are what forms your steps in the direction that you're going. And this world will try to define you by where you've been, you see, because the world doesn't know where you're going. They only can define you by what they have seen. So they say, you did that. And you failed there, and you screwed up here, and you didn't do so good there. So that means you are this. And they define us as that, but according to our past. But that's the only way the world can. And if we do that, and we hear that, and we accept that, and we go, okay, well, I did that. Yeah, I did that. Okay, I messed up there. Yeah, I guess that really was me. But then I guess that's who I am. No, that's the way the world defines you, as backwards. But God looks at us in only the way that God can, in the most amazing way ever, looks at us and says, I don't define you backwards. I define you forward. I look down and say, this is who you are because of who I am. This is who you'll become because of what I've done in your life. God has a plan to define us forward. Now, Paul talks about this in verse 12. He says, not that I've already obtained this. I want to know His power. I want to know this, but I haven't obtained all of this, and I haven't already been made perfect. So he says, I know that my past, I know what it is, and I haven't been there yet. In verse 13, he says, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it. He says, I understand that this is my past. But I know, but God is defining me forward. God is defining me because of not what I have done, but where I'm going and who I am in Him. In God, we're defined forward. God doesn't ignore who we are now, but sees us who we can become. He looks at us, and in the most amazing way, and in a way that it would take way too long to understand, He takes the righteousness of Christ and immediately puts it on you. If you have a relationship with God, if you've given your heart to Jesus, then He says, in every way, totally, wholly, completely, you are made perfect because I'm defining you forward. Only God can do that. Only through a relationship with Jesus Christ can you have it. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, it says this. We will grow, okay, so that speaks of change, to become in every aspect. I'm so glad He put that in there. Because sometimes we think, well, in this aspect I can grow and get stronger in God, but in that aspect, I won't. That aspect's too hard. That aspect isn't me. I'm not going to be able to do that. That's just going to be a weak area in my life. But He says we will grow to become in every aspect, in everything, in every aspect of your life. Now, you say, well, I don't see that. No, you don't. Because just like Paul, you haven't already got there. But when God sees you, that's what He sees. Because you know what He sees when He looks at you? He sees the righteousness of Jesus Christ, which is complete. Because it goes on to say, we will grow to become in every aspect the mature, literally perfect, but understanding, having grown and become mature, body of Him who is the head. You got to catch that. We will become mature of Him who is the head, Jesus Christ. So Christ and the fullness of Christ, everything that Christ is, the perfection of Christ, the righteousness of Christ, the holiness of Christ is poured into His body. And that's what we will become. So when God sees us, He sees us as the body, where Jesus Christ and all He is pouring into us, defines us forward and says, that is how I defined you. You say, well, how can God love me? When I say, Jesus, forgive me, and I have a relationship, how can He really forgive me of these things or that thing? How can He see those things and is He just ignoring them? No. What happens is the righteousness of Christ has been imputed, literally, what a theological word that the Bible uses, has been given over to you, covers you completely. So when Christ sees you, it's not that He's saying, oh, man, can I? Okay. No. He sees the righteousness of Christ. He sees all that we have been made in Him. And Paul declared that. See, that is how God defines you. You are defined this morning, if you have a right relationship with God, as the righteousness of Christ. How good is that? Come on now. How good is that? How great is that God defines us by the fact of who His Son is in us. Only Jesus Christ can do that. Only God can do that. And the power of His resurrection. You see? So that's why Paul said, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection. I just don't want to know Him as a person. I don't want to know Him as a religion. I don't want to know Him as just something I go to on Sundays. I want to know the power, because the power is what transforms me so that when God sees me, He defines me as holy and mature. But definition alone is not enough. And sometimes people live their life just being, well, I'm defined, and they ignore the rest of what Paul talks about. Because the second thing we need to understand about intentional growth is that intentional growth comes from allowing God to transform your passions. It's not just definition, it's transformation. Oh, and that's the good news. Otherwise, this life would just be, we would go to heaven, but it would be pretty miserable because we wouldn't be growing. We'd be covered in the righteousness of God, but, we wouldn't grow in the things of God. We wouldn't be changing. But how many know it's not just definition, it's transformation? And what we have here is that God coming down and says, I'm not just going to see you forward of where you're going to be and who you're going to be in my righteousness. I'm going to actually change you now. That is mind-boggling. when we think of how stubborn and how hard and how resistant we are in our carnal nature to the things of God, that God says, I know, but I can take that and I can transform it and I can make you into something you won't believe. 10 years from now, as you take intentional steps in me, as you're defined by your relationship with me, as you walk in things, I will actually transform who you are. You will think differently by the renewing of your mind. You'll behave differently. You will speak differently. You're actually going to be transformed. That's so encouraging in what God can do in our life. We're defined by God, but we're not just defined. We're actually transformed. So it's not just saying, okay, I'm forgiven, I'm going to heaven. God has so much more. The transformation of how we walk. We're defined by Christ. Now we're actually being transformed by His power that He's stirring in us. Now, he does this, and Paul shows this in a way that it's really easy for us in our English version to totally miss the impact of what Paul tries to write. In verse 12 and in verse 14, both times, he says this one little phrase. He says, I press on. Now, if you look that up and you try to define that, then it's simple and you understand that it means I strain forward, I reach out, I lean forward. But the impact of the word is so much greater as Paul would have wrote it. Because really what this word comes from and how this word was always used was used of a religious persecutor. It was used of someone who was over the top zealot and persecuting someone because of their faith. And that's how Paul was before, when he was Saul, before he was defined by Jesus Christ in a relationship. He was persecuting and pressing against the church. Now, here's the amazing part. Paul writes this word, and I think he knew when he wrote this word what it meant. I think something must have jumped in his heart and said, I used to press this way. I used to press against God. I used to press against the church. I used to think this way. And now that same passion, that same person, that same zeal that I was going there is being used this way. And I'm pressing for God. I'm pressing for God, what God's doing in my life. And for the greater things that He's working, He took who Paul was, He actually transformed him. Paul or Saul, his name was changed and became Paul. And where he was pressing against the things of God, he actually was transformed by pressing for the things of God. So when he wrote that and says, I press on, he's thinking, I used to press this way. Come on, I was against him. You know, Christians died at Paul's hands. People suffered and were thrown in prison. And Paul says, I got to forget those things because I'm not that person anymore. I've been transformed by the renewing of my mind, by who Jesus Christ is in me, by the power of His resurrection, and now I'm pressing forward. I know you see your weaknesses. You see your struggles. You see where you're not strong and you're not doing so well and you're not really able to handle this area. I know all those areas, but I'm telling you what, the truth of what we find here is that Jesus says, I will take those very passions, those very weaknesses, those very things that you think are holding you back, and I have the power to transform those very things and turn them around so that we're actually working for me and are strengthening who you are. Only God can do that. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Because we disqualify ourselves so often, do we not? We say, I can't do that, or I'm not able to do that, because we see these areas of weakness, and God says, no. Give those things to me. Trust those things to me. Take steps of faith, and I will take those things and actually transform them into something greater. I was in high school. I love God. I grew up in church, like I said, all my life, and gave my heart to Jesus Christ when I was really, really young. I was filled with the Holy Spirit and released prayer language and just moving in the things of God when I was very, very young, very, very young. But it didn't mean that everything was just made perfect. I was still a young man in high school that just had the passions of life and passions of everything. How many know what I'm talking about? I don't need to go any further, right? You know? So a friend of mine calls me up and says, Greg, senior year in high school, says, Greg, we met these girls, and there's three of them, and me and his friend, both I knew really well, friends of mine on the football team and such. He said they want to go to Six Flags, in Texas, the original Six Flags. And he said, come on. I said, go with me. He said, let's all go together. Okay, right off the bat, you met these girls? Where did you meet these girls? And that's why I said, where did you meet these girls? Oh, Greg, they're 3 girls from Topeka, Kansas. I know these details. I remember very clearly. And they're cheerleaders, all 3 of them. And I go, okay, where'd you meet these girls? Okay, well, we're at the bar, Okay. So something inside me said, Greg, this is not a good thing. But someone else inside of me said, yeah, but I want that thing. So after praying all morning, I just got up and I went. I said, okay, I'll go with you. I know you, from your pastor, you expect something different. I got there. And God has such a sense of humor. Gorgeous girls, literally. Beautiful young ladies. And especially the one that I was with, because they were already paired up. Oh, this is yours. Really? Okay. And I first saw her, and she was so pretty and just had a great smile. And then she started to talk. The most foul mouth. I was learning. I don't even know what that word means. Can those 2 words go together? How do you do that? And I was in awe. I didn't say anything because I was in awe. How can you say so many words? And I at one point I finally said something about, and she said, I don't blankety blank cuss. Okay. Didn't hear it, didn't even know it. And I probably almost, because she was really, really hot, could have gone with that. Except then she pulls out the cigarettes and she's just smoking. I mean, not like a cigarette. Like there was not a time from the beginning. I think nowadays you probably can't even smoke at Six Flags. But then you could. Dates me, I know. But way back in those good old days, yeah. So just one after another. So I'm just dying. My ears are thinking, and my brain is bleeding. I'm just going, oh, man. And then afterwards, we get in the car, and we're going home because we all rode together. And they start passing out the beer, in the car driving. And I'm thinking, I didn't even taste the beer, much less, drink it with everything. And so my friend knew I was a Christian, so he just wanted to hand it to me. You just hold it, Greg. So you're cool, just cool. And that's when all of a sudden something just started stirring me, and I realized I'm not this person. And the transformation that God had been doing in my life started right up, and I said no. For the first time, literally all day, I said, no, I don't want to drink. Of course, everyone's talking in the car, and we're crammed in there. There's 6 of us literally in this car, We're all crammed in there, and everyone, stop. Head turn. How does that happen? There are conversations going on, but I just said, no, I don't want it. Everyone just stopped and looked at me. And then he said, well, Greg doesn't drink and things like that. And then I thought, oh, Lord, just get me home. Just get me home. And then when the little wind-up cigarette started to come out with the green smoke, that's when I really knew, literally, in the car as they were driving with the beer in their hand, okay? And so I just thought, Lord, if you can get me home, if I can just live to be home, I don't know. I'm thinking, or if I get pulled over, I can just see it now, because I'm in the car. I smell like weed because it's all over the place. There's alcohol spilling on me, things because we're literally on top of each other. And then the cigarette, how she can smoke the regular cigarette and the weed at the same time, I don't know. And cuss at the same time. And have the beer going. But it's all going on, things like that. But you know what they did? They dropped me off first. And then I didn't even want to know what happened after that. They dropped me off first. Because I realized that something had happened in me. And here's the question. Which way are you leaning? Which way are you pressing? Sometimes we say, I want to be close to the world. I want to love God because I want to go to heaven because hell scares me, right? I don't want to go to hell. It's like hot. I don't want to do that, And so I want to go to heaven, but I want to be as close to that line as the world. I want to play with that. I want to be like that. And the question is here, which way are you pressing? You see, are you pressing? You're either pressing toward the world or you're pressing toward the things of God. And when you're pressing toward the things of God, God is transforming you. He is taking who you were and making you who you are. I think about that and I think, God, your grace is so amazing. It would have been so easy for me to just say, take the beer. And after I took the beer, it would have been one step to another to lead me to a completely different sermon of repentance. When I did, it was completely different. I can share all this. Wife's in the back doing the kids. Anyway, But you know what? God was transforming me. Which way are you pressing? Are you pressing toward the things? Do you have a heart that says, God, I just want more of you? Paul said, I want to know Christ. If I could just know you more and the power of your resurrection. Because I just don't want to know of a religion. I just don't want to know a formality. I want to know and have a relationship. That's the power. And Paul concludes and ends with this. Intentional growth. He put it, go ahead, comes, put it up on the third one. Intentional growth comes from choosing the prize. Because all of a sudden, everything gets put in perspective for Paul here. Everything gets lined up here. Because all of a sudden, he starts talking, in verse 14, he says that I press forward. What is he pressing forward? Toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Jesus Christ. In other words, I don't want to just see the temporal. I want to understand that there's something greater. And it's so easy to get trapped into the temporal, is it not? It's so easy to look around and say, you know, I want this, or I want to do that, or I want to and get trapped in what we think is we should be focusing on, what we think we should be looking at. You know, I love, in the mornings, I love sometimes to go to Starbucks and I get their classic oatmeal. You ever had that classic oatmeal? It has nuts and it has, you know, these raisins and it has, anybody ever done that? No, whatever. I do. I like that. It's just, I don't know if it's healthy at all. It just seems healthy, you know. They've convinced me it's healthy, so I eat it. You know, it's oatmeal, it's nuts. How healthier can you get, right? So I'm eating this, and I get, but they give me a plastic spoon with it. But I don't eat it because there's a plastic spoon there. I like the oatmeal and everything. But how silly would it be for me to get that oatmeal with that plastic spoon and all the food and stir it all up, and it has brown sugar in it. There you go. That's the bad part of it. Brown sugar and all the nuts in it and everything. You stir it all up, and all I do is sit there and look at the spoon. Wow, what a spoon. That spoon's amazing. It's plastic. How do they make that spoon? I wonder how that happens. Look at that. It's a spoon. It's probably a break, but wow. You think, eat it with your hand, whatever. It's about the oatmeal. It's about the oatmeal. It's not about the spoon. And yet, we think it's about this life and this world and that money and that job and that thing and that thing. And we have all these things that we try to put together. We have all these things, and we miss the whole importance of really what it's about. The world will tell you it's all about the base. It's about the base, about the base. I'm telling you, it's not about the base. It's not about the desires of the world. It's not about these things. Some of you going, I don't have a clue. There's an age limit, and that's whatever. The point being, the world is convinced it's about those temporal things. It's about those things in here that are here today and gone tomorrow. And God said it's about so much more. It's about spending eternity with God. It's about seeing how God changes you so we're not the same anymore. It's about where God is taking us. It's about focusing and saying, God, I know I'm right here. I know I'm in this spot, but I know I don't have to stay here because that's where I'm going. That's where you're going to take me. That is where you're going to change everything about me. This last week was come on up, David, my father's anniversary. We passed away on the 19th last year. So all my family were calling me. I'm thinking, don't call me. Sometimes you don't want to think about it. That's what I do. I don't know about you, but I procrastinate or I put off. It's not there. I don't want to think about it. And so they were calling me and we're talking. And my sister shared a story about my mom who she took to the gravesite. And first she said, I don't want to go. I don't want to see the gravesite. And then she went and they were there for a while. Of course, it's cold. It's cold there. It's not like Tampa. It's cold, even in Dallas. And so my sister's going, okay, I'm ready to go. And my mom said, and she's dealing with her own medical issues and such, but she just said, I don't want to go. I don't want to leave him here. And my sister, God bless her heart, she just said, Mom, he's not here. He's not here. There's something greater than where he's at. He's with Jesus. He's with God. You just got to remember, he's not here. This is so for us to remember. And that's a good thing. We need to remember. But that's not where my father's at. My father is in heaven. When my brother, who was the only one who wasn't with us when my father passed away, was on the plane, he was flying. And this happened. This is absolute truth. The very second that we know, because we know when it happened, because we were all gathered around the bed, that my father passed away. My brother was on the plane, the only one that couldn't be there out of 6 kids. He was on the plane, and that very second, all of a sudden, he began to weep uncontrollably on the plane. You know, people around him thinking, okay, you know, everyone moving over. But he was just weeping. He didn't care, because all of a sudden, he saw, at that very moment, he had like a day vision, dream, whatever. He saw my father going into heaven and being with Jesus Christ at that very moment. But not as a 80-year-old man when he passed away, but as that 20-year-old man within his Army, Air Force, uniform, and just as a young man. And he saw that there. And you know what? Even though he couldn't be with us when my father passed, I think he saw something that none of us saw. Because, you know, life is more than just here. It's not just about this. It's not just about this world. It's about the way that God is changing us so that forever we will be able to live and be with Him. Do you receive the word this morning? Come on, give God thanks. Give God thanks for what He's doing.